streaming.
Okay, Chair Davis, we have a quorum. We are ready to go, sir.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this January 27th, 2021 called meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I'm Eric Davis, Chair of the Board, and I call this meeting to order. Prior to the start of the meeting, a quorum of 7 members of the board was confirmed. Board members are reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. I now ask for a motion to approve the January 27th, 2021 agenda.
So moved. This
Motion by Ms. Kamnitz, second.
Second, Dr. Donna Tipton-Rogers.
Second by Dr. Tipton-Rogers. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Ms. Kamnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Keenan, Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton-Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. White,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor,
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell,
Aye. I'm going to be in and out because of another meeting, but aye.
yes, sir. Vice Chair Duncan,
Yeah.
Chair Davis,
Yes.
it's unanimous.
Great. Motion carries. We have an agenda. Thank you. I note for the record, the board will take a roll call vote on all items requiring action on the agenda at the conclusion of this meeting. We'll now proceed directly to our committee reports, and we'll begin with the Student Learning and Achievement Committee, chaired by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. And I'd like to also thank Dr. Oxendine, the Vice Chair of this committee, for her continuing input and support in this work. Before we start our presentation, a couple of comments. I have been told that the revision of social studies standards is rarely an easy task. I guess the nature of the material pretty much assures that, but where we find ourselves today, the events of the past year have accentuated the importance of getting this right, and a lot of work has gone towards that need to get this right. In January, we discussed draft 4 of the standards, including examples of supporting documents that the board had requested. Several board members and Superintendent Truitt asked that the staff consider refining some of the terms included in the standards and therefore some of the supporting documents. Finding a way to honor differing viewpoints was not easy, but I have to say that Dr. Stegall, Dr. Mullenix, Dr. Day, and Dr. Carlin have brought us a combination of standards and supporting documents that do honor those viewpoints. For clarity, let's call today's version Draft 5. Next week, we will be voting on standards, not supporting documents, but those documents are important to our understanding of how the standards will be implemented in classrooms across the state. And that is why they continue to be included in our discussion of Draft 5 today. I'd like to say I am deeply grateful for the wealth of experience our leaders in DPI brought to this task, and for their willingness to think, discuss, and reconsider over and over again to get us to Draft 5, which we are about to to see. So I think Ms. Truitt, you're going to start us off?
No, I am not.
No? All right. Dr. Mullenix then.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'll wait until the slide is up. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming back today to discuss this very important topic. I'm going to go ahead and get us going, and then I'll turn it over to several of my colleagues. So we can go ahead to the standards and curriculum portion. Yes, right there. So if you recall back, I guess it was a couple weeks ago, and then also in the summertime, we made the distinction between standards and curriculum, as well as instruction. And we highlighted that at the state level, we developed the standards, that is the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. And then at the local level, the decision is made for the curriculum that is chosen. That includes those texts, lesson plans, activities, tasks, classroom assessments, and so forth. And then you see on down to the micro level in the classroom of that actual day-to-day instruction. So just to re-emphasize that, again, the state writes the standards, and our support for LEAs and charters as they delve into the curriculum and instruction is actually going to be in the supporting documents that coincide with those standards. The supporting documents will play a key role in the daily life of the curriculum and instruction. And in our discussions, both regarding social studies standards and all of our sections that we support across the continuum of learning, those supporting documents really are the ones that teachers rely on for their day-to-day pieces. And so that is why they're so essential. And Dr. Lori Major Carlin will go into detail about what those will look like to support those teachers. And then also just to reemphasize that standards are the only documents that are approved by the State Board of Education. With that being said, we definitely intend to bring back those supporting documents and the progress as we work on those so that we can keep the State Board of Education, our superintendent, our colleagues, and the public informed as to the progress on those supporting documents. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Neha Shaw-Coltrane, who's going to go further into the legislation and policies surrounding these standards as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and giving us all this opportunity to share with you some of the background of the standard course of study. So what I want to do is review with you the legislation and the policies that inform and guide our work so that it's really clear the role of the department and what we're responding to. So first of all, we do have a state board policy. Those of you that are more experienced members, you'll recall 2 years ago, 4 years ago, we revised that policy, but it does lay out very clearly the timeline, process in which standards are revised, created, and adopted. And so that policy relates to all of the standard course of study, whether they're DTL standards, CTE standards, or coming out of standards, curriculum, and instruction. This is the same process that, for example, Dr. Hemphill used with the computer science standards. So and the biggest part of that policy is ensuring that we're getting feedback from the field and other external partners. Our graduation requirements also relate to this, just as a reminder that we already approved, you all approved last March was the approval. In February, we shared with you all of the changes that were mandated through legislation regarding adding the economics and personal finance course, as well as the new founding principles of the United States and North Carolina civic literacy. Both of those courses had a timeline on them. EPF had to be into place this school year, and founding principles must be in place this upcoming fall. In that legislation, which is also linked here, also said that we were to go through a revision process to ensure only 4 courses in our social studies high school requirements. So I want to remind us of that and why not only this work is important and urgent for our students and teachers, but also in response to legislation. Also a note that the standards also have other, the K-8 standards as well, also have some legislated content, in particular at the 4th grade and the 8th grade. So lots of people get involved with our social studies. Like Ms. Camden said, we did want to lay this out for you to remind you of the urgency of these standards, in particular for the incoming high school graduation class, the incoming freshmen in the fall 2021. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw-Coltrane, and good morning, everyone. This table illustrates some of the ways that research, evaluation, and consultation were used throughout the standards review and revision process. During each stage in the process, we used surveys, focus groups, and the data review committee to inform all aspects of standards review and to inform recommendations for standards development. NC stakeholders have been and are critical to the review and revision process. Teams of writers and reviewers have been working with the current standards, feedback from stakeholders, research from other states and professional organizations, and analyzing educational trends to inform the revision of the proposed standards. These photos are from our face-to-face kickoff meeting in September 2019. The exploration phase has been ongoing since the current standards were adopted in 2012. With the approval by the State Board in April 2019 of beginning the process to revise the social studies standards, a more intensive exploration of wants and needs from teachers and district leaders around the state took place. The standards were revised beginning in September 2019, with the 5th draft now presented to the State Board in January 21. Initially, the installation year was supposed to be 2021, but due to delays in the approval of standards, the installation timeline was shortened. The implementation year will be 21-22, assuming the standards are approved. There currently is no state test for social studies, which means districts will have some flexibility in transitioning to the new standards. However, due to the legislative constraints Ms. Shaw-Coltrane just discussed, incoming freshmen in the 21-22 school year will need the new civic literacy course sometime during their high school career to graduate. So districts will need to begin implementing in 21-22. In accordance with SCOS 12, our approach to standards revision has been feedback-based, research-informed, improvement-oriented, and process-driven. As reflected in this slide, our writing and review teams were comprised of educators from all 8 SBE districts, and we had tremendous feedback from the field. These, once again, are the voices that are echoed in the standards. Additionally, these educators and other stakeholders will be instrumental in helping craft the resource documents and professional development that is the next step in the process. Throughout the revision process, the teams have endeavored to follow the guidance of the State Board of Education. To that end, the following refinement requests were addressed. Back in the July meeting, the State Board of Education asked us to return to the writing and review teams to ensure the inclusion of explicit language identifying topics, groups, and ideas. You also asked us to incorporate another opportunity for public feedback. And finally, you asked to see examples of what additional support resources might look like once standards are adopted. During the January meeting and in subsequent conversations, there were objections to 3 specific terms that appeared within the standards. We will demonstrate how those refinements were addressed as well. To ensure a cohesive sequence, I'll begin with the public feedback slides that we shared at the beginning of the month. Once again, one of the most important charges we were given was to encourage as much public feedback from as many sources as possible. Throughout this revision process, we've been open and transparent and communicative with all stakeholders. This slide demonstrates all the myriad ways we endeavor to communicate with all stakeholders to obtain feedback. As we shared earlier this month, the survey for Draft 4 yielded over 1,500 responses. As you can see, the public feedback was substantially positive that the standards did meet the goals for providing more inclusive content and language. Here, you will see the requested refinement of terms. The left column indicates the way that the terms appeared in the Draft 4 version earlier this month. The column next to that indicates the proposed changes to those terms, and then to the right are how we will fully define those terms to ensure that they are inclusive and representative. Glossary links for each course will be provided at the top of each set of course standards. Additionally, new terms and standards will be called out and defined in the Unpacking resource. Fortunately, we have some examples to walk you through how this will appear to a teacher. This slide is representative of the tremendous efforts that were made by the social studies standards teams to include explicit language. This particular standard has 3 objectives that are impacted by changing the 3 requested terms. I do think it is very valuable to recognize that the standards and objectives in Draft 5 are still vastly more inclusive and representative, as you can see in these 3 highlighted examples. So minus the highlights and text box, this would be the appearance of the standards the board would approve. Again, each set will have a glossary link at the top. Now, let's look at how we will provide additional supports for teachers who will be determining the best ways to teach these standards. As we've mentioned before, once the standards are adopted, the DPI team and advisors will begin working on supporting documents that will serve as resources for teachers to address the new standards. The DPI K-12 Social Studies team will be working diligently to provide a glossary of terms, disciplinary strand maps of vertical progressions, crosswalks to the former standards, and other professional development opportunities for district curriculum developers and classroom teachers. In order to demonstrate what some of these support documents will do for educators, we've created draft versions to share with you today. Our first snapshot of support documents is from the glossary. This reflects examples from the glossary the team has developed to support understanding of terminology used in the standards and objectives. The glossary will allow district leaders and teachers to build curriculum and lessons around a common understanding of terminology and language. The glossary will provide definitions to terms in the standards that might be difficult to understand due to multiple interpretations or ambiguity, such as the word local. Believe it or not, there were multiple responses in the public feedback inquiring about what did we mean when we wrote local. The glossary of terms will also supply more clarifying language with regards to terms that lend themselves to multiple definitions and interpretations. As you can see in the snapshot example, we've included definitions for terms such as identity and racism, all sourced appropriately. Please keep in mind the purpose of the glossary is not to rewrite definitions for terms that can easily be found in any standard dictionary and textbook. The purpose is to provide a resource that social studies educators can access in order to better understand the intent of terminology used in the objectives in appropriate context to the disciplines of social studies upon which courses have been created. This next example is of the Unpacking document from American History, previously shared in January. One change we made this week is to marry the students will know and understand columns and add a glossary column for words that appear for the first time in a set of standards and require further definition. For this standard, you can see the standard listed at the top, the overarching concepts, then in the far left column, the objective where marginalized is in bold. The next column provides the glossary definition of that word or any others that might need to be defined for a particular objective. The remaining columns will provide mastery and understandings and sample topics for teachers to use in comparing competing historical narratives that range from the Stamp Act to the Wilmington coup of 1898 to the annexation of Hawaii. Students would need to read different narratives and be able to compare the differing viewpoints of what occurred. This approach enables teachers to weave diverse narrative throughout the curriculum. The potential formative assessments suggested provide primary and secondary sources to help students work through those comparisons. It is important to note that the examples in the example topics column are not intended to be exhaustive list, a recommendation, or curriculum, which is developed or selected by schools and districts. Instead, it will include a few diverse people or topics that can help the teacher, instructional coach, or district leader better understand the intent of the objective and the types of content that can be used to teach an objective. These unpacking documents are both the most labor-intensive and the most useful for our teachers. We've thought about everything from the assessment examples to the size of the paper teachers will be able to print these out on to take notes and make them working documents. This is the template of what the team has designed for the crosswalk that will be one of the supporting documents for teachers and district leaders. The crosswalk documents will compare the new 2021 standards with the current 2010 standards. The crosswalks provide some insight into the similarities and differences between these two sets of standards, especially as they relate to content, scope, and conceptual understanding. Where applicable, this document will also inform district leaders and teachers of objectives that have been incorporated into another social studies course at a level either above or below. This is a template of what the team has designed for the Strand Maps that will be one of the support documents for teachers and district leaders. The Strand Maps are documents specific to social studies and are organized around the 5 most common strands of study among the disciplines of social studies. Each strand map outlines the vertical progression of objectives written to a disciplinary strand of the North Carolina K-12 Social Studies Standard Course of Study. Each strand map outlines the objectives that have been written to a particular strand. The example before you is of the Civics and Government strand. In outlining those objectives, educators will find the concepts that are essential to the teaching of each objective in the Civics and Government strand identified in red font in the first column. So that there's no doubt about the concepts that must be taught, these concepts have been listed in the second column. The last column is a unique addition to the design of the current social studies strand maps. This last column provides social studies educators with a comprehensive outline of the conceptual themes running through the objectives of a strand based on the grade band. The beauty of this additional column is that it informs district leaders and teachers of the conceptual understandings that students are expected to acquire by the end of a grade band. The vertical progression of the social studies strand maps have proven to be a tremendous support for curriculum leaders developing resources and a support for local districts as well as classroom teachers using them. Once the standards are approved, we will be able to begin the extensive work of producing these support documents. Our current timeline has us returning to the board to share our versions of the glossary, strand maps, crosswalks, and a professional development plan in April. Again, these are not items that require board approval. We just want to ensure awareness and opportunities for discussion. This process will include Superintendent Truitt, State Board of Education members, Teachers of the Year, Principals of the Year, and other stakeholders. At this time, I'd like to hand it back to our fearless leader, Dr. Stegall, for summary and recommendations.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you to all the team members who've given lots of effort and time with this. We once again want to thank the board for their leadership on this. We're happy to share that draft 4 public feedback resulted again in an 85% overall favorable for adoption of these standards. Writing review teams were comprised of educators from across all 8 State Board of Ed districts, and public feedback surveys represented the opinions of over 7,000 stakeholders. And they were open for 103 days total. So our recommendation is that the State Board of Education in the February meeting approve the proposed standards. We'll continue to share ongoing plans as was shared for supporting our districts and charters and successful implementation, and we will provide regular reporting on those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you who presented this so clearly and broadly to us, so that I think we really do understand this very complicated process. So our discussion, our recommendation today and our discussion will focus around draft 5. And just to be absolutely clear, I wonder if one of you could speak to the actual changes in the standards draft 5 compared to draft 4. Are the changes all are associated with the 3 terms that we looked at, racism, discrimination, and identity? Are those the only changes that were made from draft 4 to draft 5 throughout the documents?
Right. This is David once again. Yes, the terms that were lifted up, systemic racism, systemic discrimination, and gender identity were all changed as was shared. And those were throughout the document. Those words those phrases were changed to the 3 that we just shared. And then the glossary will have clarification of terms to include some further descriptions, but we did make all those changes that were requested.
And there were no other changes in the standards, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that was absolutely clear. I'd like to open the floor now for discussion. I think that I hope very much that we will hear from everyone around the table. And who would like to start? I know someone is going to step up here. Otherwise, I'll just call on somebody.
All right. Well, this is Lieutenant Governor Robinson. If no one's going to take the lead on this, I'll certainly take the lead. First off, I'll say good morning to all of you all that are on this call. Also, I would say I have the utmost respect for everyone who's working hard on these standards. I understand that there's a lot of difficult work going into them, and we commend you for the work that you're doing. That being said, I have to reiterate my thoughts from the last meeting on these standards. I'm going to speak plain because, quite frankly, that's just who I am. I do not like these standards as they are written. The 3 minor changes that were made are not satisfactory for me. They do not change the first issue that I have with these standards. And the first issue that I have with these standards is the overall tone. I don't like the tone of these standards, what's written in them. I think they are politically charged. I think they are divisive. And I think that they are, quite frankly, smack of a lot of leftist dogma. And I say that with full confidence. I am not a person who is not politically aware or politically astute. We'll just say it plain. I know all the code words, and I know what they lead to. And I don't like where these standards can lead our students when it comes to teaching them. I do not like the tone of these standards. I think the standards that we had before these were much better. And the tone is the number one thing that I do not like about these standards. Secondly, I just think that the things that we've added into these standards, quite frankly, excuse me if I offend anyone, I don't think they really serve a purpose. I made this comment at the last meeting. At 52 years of age, I was a student of Guilford County Schools, public schools, from grade 1 through 12. There was never a time when any of our teachers excluded anyone. We learned about Native Americans. We learned about the contributions of African Americans. We learned about the contributions of women. We learned about the complex issue of slavery. I can remember distinct conversations that we had with our teachers in middle school and in high school about those complex issues and how they helped shape this nation. So those issues have never been left out of public education. They've always been there, and they've always been taught by good, educated, well-meaning teachers who are trying to build the minds of their students, to teach them how to think instead of tell them what to think. And so I don't think that these things that we have included have been for the benefit of the students. Quite frankly, I think they're for the benefit of those who have political and social agendas. And then the third thing that I think is blatantly wrong with these standards is I just think they're age appropriate. I have said this several times. I don't think there's any reason why we should be teaching first, second, third, fourth graders about complex issues that adults, quite frankly, can't understand. We have members of Congress, we have members of the highest ranks of our government who don't even understand our own Constitution. There's no reason why we should be trying to teach second graders about the complex issues of race. Those children have enough on their plate learning how to read and write and do mathematics. And I think there's enough on the bone in those three subjects to teach those children those things. In fact, if we're trying to teach second graders, many of whom cannot read on a first grade level, complex issues about race and gender identity and all these things that we're talking about in history, how are they going to learn that if they can't read properly? I think in those grades, we need to strictly focus on giving kids that base of education that's going to allow them to succeed later in life. Quite frankly, there is nothing in these standards that I see that are going to help our children succeed in life later. Nothing. And again, I reiterate my utmost objection to these standards, and my vote is going to be an absolute no unless they are completely revised and we go back to the standards that we have before, because I find them, quite frankly, unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Other thoughts?
Ms. Chemnitz, this is Olivia.
Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you very much. And good morning to everyone, the board, my colleagues of the board, and also those, the staff, of course, and those listening in, the listening audience. I want to dig a little bit deeper into the word changes. From systemic, I believe systemic was removed from the term systemic racism. And I believe gender was removed, that bringing together would create the term gender identity. Now, to me, I would still need to know how racism minus systemic, how identity minus gender is contextualized in the objectives. Just removing words doesn't change the intent of the objective. So at some point, right away, I'd like to, and I can do this on my own. I'm not going to take time from this, from this discussion right here, this hour and a half to do that. But I just because we tweak a word or two doesn't mean that the overall concept that we hope the students will learn and master, that doesn't diminish that. So it's the contextualization, I suppose, of those two words minus the their two adjectives. So that's one point I want to make. I did notice, and I'm not going to ask the staff to go back to the PowerPoint frame, but it is the frame that defines some of the keywords that have been altered, changed. Racism, for instance. I did note maybe the last sentence in that definition, there is some pivot to the term structural racism. Is that the same as systemic, institutional and structural racism? Are we getting back to systemic racism? Is my question. That'll be a word, that's a question for the staff, but I do want to raise it publicly because within that definition of racism, a teacher certainly has the flexibility to do that because principals cannot monitor and supervise teachers instructional day all day long. It's just virtually impossible. Could still move into some avenue of systemic racism. So those are the 2 major points that I want to highlight. Stepping back from the standards, and this picks up on some of the comments made by the Lieutenant Governor, stepping back as I've done from the standards, not so much the lower grades, but in the upper grades. I take away the feeling of America, the oppressor, not America, the land of opportunity. So it is a tone that I'm receiving when I look at the standards in the entirety, especially more specifically in the upper grades. If we could amend the tone, and you can't amend the tone unless you amend the standards and the objectives. That would please me enormously. I love social studies. It is one of the areas in my area of certification. I've taught it many, many years ago. We have come a long way in the world of racial equality, and I will say this as a minority. When I began teaching many years ago, I could have never dreamt, being an American Indian, having the opportunity and the privilege to serve on the State Board of Education. It wouldn't have been possible as an American Indian. So for me not to admit that we have traveled a long road on this journey toward racial equality would be, for me not to say that publicly would be disingenuous. And thank you, Ms. Kamnitz, for allowing me this time to make those comments.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine, for sharing those with us.
Ms. Kamnitz, this is David Stegall. May I ask a question?
Yes, please, Dr. Scott.
So this is, I guess, to both the Lieutenant Governor and to Ms. Oxendine. Some of the points that have been raised, I need some clarification on, we need some clarification on. One, there's no mention of gender identity in elementary, so I heard that used, and then I'm not sure if there's a specific example that's being referenced. I'd be glad to look at that, but it doesn't exist in the standard, so I'm not sure if I've misunderstood the comment. And then the second thing is both the comments around the tone of being about oppression. If we could get a specific example in the standards that we're talking about, because these standards were created by teachers, not by the department, and it's following state board policy. And then second thing is the standards aren't set up to create a tone. They're set up to have dialogue for students. And if there's specific examples, it would be easier for us to contextualize what the concerns are. So that's just the questions I have.
Ms. Kamnitz.
Yes, Dr. Oxendine.
I will be more than glad to find a few examples, and it's in totality is what I'm speaking of, but I certainly will provide. I will give a few examples, and it could be my wrong impression of reading things. So clarification seems to be in order.
Thank you. I'm sure Dr. Stegall would appreciate that. Other board members?
Ms. Kamnitz, this is Maureen.
Yes, Ms. Stover.
So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Lieutenant Governor Robinson and Dr. Oxendine for sharing their thoughts and their perspective on the standards. I'm incredibly happy to hear that Lieutenant Governor Robinson did have an opportunity to learn such a varied social studies curriculum in Guilford County. But I did not get that same type of education in social studies coming up. And so I appreciate the work that the committee has done to make these standards so that they're reflective of multiple viewpoints and multiple histories. And I also think it's very important that we acknowledge that while some students are currently getting education that includes those multiple viewpoints, others aren't. And by having these standards, that means that every one of our kids in every classroom in North Carolina is going to get the same standardized social studies education where those multiple viewpoints and those multiple perspectives are included. I also think that it is important that we start having some of those conversations about the complex issues with our kids in elementary school. We have a system where we build upon what students learn from year to year. And by introducing some of those difficult concepts as elementary school students, we're giving them the basis so that they're able to engage in conversations and to have rhetorical conversations as they go into middle school and high school. So I think it's important that we leave those concepts at the elementary level so that we can begin the process of introducing those to our students, and we can begin the process of teaching them how to have those discussions with their classmates and with their teachers.
Thank you, Ms. Stover. Other comments?
Ms. Kamnitz, this is Superintendent Truitt.
Yes, Superintendent Truitt, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, I echo my colleagues' thanks to Dr. Stegall and Dr. Mullenix and Dr. Carlin and the whole team, and to Ms. Kamnitz for leading us through this very challenging experience, for lack of a better term. I would like to just say something specific to the changes that have been presented today. I think that there was feedback given in January, just as feedback was given in June prior, and that feedback, that what you're seeing today was an attempt to address feedback from January from specific board members. I agree that it is necessary to remove as Dr. Oxendine stated, remove the terms systemic and gender from the words racism, discrimination, and identity. Mainly because there are multiple forms of racism: interpersonal, structural, institutional, internalized, and there are multiple forms of identity, as is laid out in the glossary, and there are multiple forms of discrimination. And so what the team has attempted to do is to expand the definition of those things, because as Lori Carlin stated in her presentation this morning, the example topics that are provided and will be provided in the supplemental documents are not exhaustive and ultimately are at the discretion of local districts and to some extent individual teachers. And so while I agree that not all children have had a social studies and history experience that does include multiple perspectives, voices, and the emphasis on articulating competing narratives, I also would say that these standards are no guarantee that any student is going to have a standardized approach to learning about history, government, and civics. And so I would also add that one reason it's important to expand the definitions of those three terms in particular, and specifically when we're talking about racism, is because the extent to which discrimination in our country remains institutionalized or can be characterized as systemic is a subjective answer, one that historians are not in agreement about. And whether or not we want to say that racism in our country is systemic and institutionalized, or that it is sporadic, personalized, and localized in parts of our country, we do on paper have a legal system that generally protects the rights and liberties of the vast majority of people in our country most of the time. And so while racism absolutely is real and needs to be included in our standards, the definition of racism must be expanded, as is the definition of identity and discrimination, to reflect the complexity of this term and to reflect the fact that the supplemental documents, the unpacking documents, need to allow the flexibility for teachers to choose which type of racism, which type of discrimination, and which type of identity is most appropriate for the objective being addressed.
Thank you, Superintendent Truitt. Other board members or advisors? I would love for everyone to speak that has an opinion here. We need to hear from you.
Chair Chemnitz, this is Todd Chastain.
Yes, Mr. Chastain.
Appreciate you and the team working hard on all the standards and the DPI team and so many folks. I heard a comment in the presentation. I think they mentioned what were the number of public comments?
I believe that altogether it was around 7,000.
But that was like stakeholders, but as far as public comments.
Yeah, that's public. That is anyone in the general. It's posted where anyone can give feedback on.
Okay, so that was 7,000. There's someone threw out a 1,500 number. I didn't know what that was, but.
Mr. Chastain, I think that was the second time we put the standards out for public comment. Was that the response was around 1,500.
So the 1,500, was that related to draft 4?
Yes.
Okay, so
right.
the 1,500 is related to draft 4. We have 1.5 million students associated with families, people, whatever. So that's like 0.001%, 1/10 of 1%. Just a thought there. If the standards were voted down, what would happen? What version would take place? The July version that was recommended wholeheartedly by DPI, or would the current version that's in use in this year apply if in the instance these standards were not approved? What would happen?
I would assume that someone would need to make a motion to approve another version if we were voting on draft 5 and it got voted down, then I would presume that the next step would be a motion to approve a different draft.
Okay, so okay, yeah, so it couldn't be, if it did not get passed, then you'd have to be thinking about, well, what replaces it? Would it be, okay, that clarifies. Thanks so much. And then one question, I know Miss Stover made a comment that we heard Lieutenant Governor Robinson talk about how some of these difficult aspects of our history, which we should be fully transparent about, and we need to disclose, and the pain and the impact and the reality, at the same time balancing it out with progress, the progress between 1860 and 1900 and 1900 and 1950, 1950 and 2000, 2021, honestly covering advancements and progress, which has occurred, so, my biggest challenge with the standards is the imbalance of, it seems to be a lot of weight on group identity conflict and negativity versus some progress. But that's just a general statement. One thing Ms. Stover mentioned, Ms. Stover, you went to Air Force Academy, didn't you?
Yes, I did go to the Air Force Academy.
Go Falcons. Go Falcons. I have family in USAPA, so I had to say that. But in any event, you mentioned that you had a different experience than Lieutenant Governor Robinson. And I know you went to school a few years ago, and I went to school many, many years ago. Would you say in 2020, the teachers, you were Teacher of the Year, like a lot of your colleagues and teachers wouldn't be covering these subjects adequately or very well in 2020? Would you say, is that kind of your experience? So I know you're talking about your personal experience, but I'm talking about like 2020.
Absolutely. And yes, when I was referring to that, I was referring to my personal experience as a student in elementary, middle, and high school. I do think that our social studies and history teachers are committed to teaching those hard truths, to having those hard conversations, and to ensuring that our students are learning from multiple viewpoints. But right now, there's not the standards that are saying that that's what they should do. And I think that's why it was critically important that the way that the standards were written and the language that was included in those standards was intentionally placed there in order to help guide teachers and then to give them the framework in order to develop those curriculums that enable them to have those hard conversations with their students and to be able to teach their students from multiple viewpoints and perspectives. As a student at the Air Force Academy, my eyes were really opened up to a lot of different perspectives that I had not experienced before. And it wasn't until that point that I realized that the America that I knew and that I had learned about was not the same for all of my classmates who literally came from across our nation. And so I do think it's very important that we begin those conversations and begin that education at the elementary, middle, and high school levels, because that helps the kids that we have in classrooms today be better prepared to take over the challenges of being the next entrepreneurs and the next policymakers and the governors and the lieutenant governors and all the different things that our amazing kids sitting in classrooms today in North Carolina will do in their future. It's our responsibility to provide a framework that gives them an education that prepares them to be the best possibly prepared the second they walk out of our doors when they graduate from 12th grade. And I feel like the work that's been done on these social studies standards is true to that, because we're doing what we need to do in order to ensure our students are prepared when they leave our classrooms.
But you don't think that's being done in 2020? You think that we've missed that for the last 5-10 years? You've been teaching for how long?
I've been in education for about 14 years. I do think we have teachers across our state who are doing that. I absolutely do. But I also think it's important that we have a document that makes that part of our curriculum. So I do think our social studies teachers are doing a phenomenal job. I think we have excellent teachers across our state who are taking on the challenges of ensuring they're educating their kids exactly how they need to be educated every day. And I'm incredibly proud of all of those teachers and of all the work they put in as they educate our kiddos. But I also think it's very important that we have a document that stipulates that this is what we expect our kids to learn in the social studies curriculum as graduates of the K-12 program in North Carolina.
And Mr. Chaston, if I could jump in here, I'm thinking back to a presentation we heard, I believe last summer, from a group of students who, of our current, I believe they're all high school students, who said to us pretty clearly that they were not receiving this kind of information and having the opportunity for the discussions. So, I mean, I think we have heard that from, a small group of students, but clearly they were not having that experience.
Yeah, and I think everybody agrees. I think we'd have a unanimous decision that you should have those discussions with civility and understanding and empathy, and we care for each other, and we're all one human race. And so, yeah, we all agree on all that. It's just kind of how you present them and what balance, because there's some curricula out there now that is being heavily promoted that skews things a certain way, and having the opportunity to be associated with work in 100 countries around the world, we see some real oppressive human rights. You look at China, forced labor. You see Uyghurs being punished, Uyghur Muslims in China. Pakistan has more people in prison and life sentence for blasphemy. Those are just words. Than any other country in the world. We saw the devastation in northern Iraq, but it's just I just want to make sure things don't. We're not going in a way that we're not following like what's happened in higher ed. There's so much grievance studies, and we focus on the negative, and we have to talk about the difficult, hard things and the failures. And but we also want to build optimism and unity and recognize, like, I'm still real thankful to be from this country with all the different flaws it has compared to a lot of places where we go to work and help and assist people in their darkest hour. But so I just that's where I wrestle with the 125 changes that were made after the DPI came and said we wholeheartedly recommend these last time, and then it just seemed like I saw a lot of the conflict, identity group conflict and negativity, and certain type of language and words expressed. And I can give you really particular specific examples, Mr. Stiegel. But the compared to, do we also balance that out with progress and the blessings and the great work of pluralism that's been accomplished? Do we balance it out with what country has provided the greatest economic opportunity for the most people out of any country on the earth? And there's 196 or so countries. I'm probably off by one or two on that, but so just the optimism too, the positivity, I don't care who I am. I want to know that there's some hope, and so I know people in here want to express all that. I'm not sure when I read. I don't know. I agree with Lieutenant Governor Robinson. When I read these standards, and I've read them 3 or 4 times now, I come away with, is this moving towards more of complaint, grievance and negativity, which has to be covered to some degree, and should be covered to some degree, because you have to have, like Teacher of the Year, Ms. Stover said, you have to have those hard conversations. And I think many teachers do and will and want to, and so do students, especially if we can do it with free speech and not certain types of voices and messages not being shut down. So in any event, those are my comments. I know there's been an incredible amount of hard work put into all that, and so that's noted, and so those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chastain.
Madam Chair, this is Mr. Ford. Could I proceed?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Ford.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll preface by saying that I have a couple of remarks before I begin. And I'm not going to be using super formal language here, so I do that at the risk of sounding like I'm complaining or have a grievance. But I just want to say that because I'm really tired, y'all. I'm tired because I feel like we're not being direct. We're not being honest. We're beating around the bush here. The staff made clear to us that the standards, the function of standards, are about what we want students to know. And if we're being honest and forthright, this debate is connected to a much longer, a much broader national discourse. I was an advisor, just like Maureen was, when the revised AP US history framework was being debated, and the same arguments for being lodged. It focuses too much on the subjugation and oppression of Black and Latinx and Native folk. It doesn't play up enough of American exceptionalism, etc. The 1776 and Patriotic Education Commission and subsequent report, which is not a scholarly document, does not have any citations at all, no bibliography. Okay, so I mean, I hear where we're coming from when it comes to both sides, but let's not engage in false equivalence here. Both sides are not equal in terms of their rootedness and evidence, evidential claims. So as much as, we're debating what students want to know, the truth is this debate is also about what we don't want students to know. And that's the subtext that I feel like we just need to go ahead and take out of our pocket and put on the table. At first, when we engaged in this discussion last month, I was assured, or at least I felt like the discussion was about the inquiry standards, the overarching standards that guide the rest of the subsequent more specific standards. And now I hear we're critiquing language around systemic racism, gender identity, and systemic discrimination. This is a deviation from what I recall the first discussion to be about. And with respect, I don't think these are refinements. Actually, I think that it makes these terms more ambiguous. I think it makes it less clear and more vague. And, to me, if we were to adopt these draft 5, it's an unnecessary concession because it just feels like a solution in desperate search of a problem. And so, one of my questions, I guess, is Why are we doing this? Can we be honest? I mean, we have heard that 85% of, and that's the overwhelming majority of the feedback has been positive, right? We were very, very clear that from the stakeholders we engaged with, that they wanted more quote unquote inclusive standards, those that focused on the experiences of the majority. And I use that term very carefully because I understand they're outliers, right? And nobody's a monolith, but the majority of the experiences for Black, Brown, Native, and queer folk. And so now we're kind of using terms like divisive, right, which is very nebulous, and to me just means things exposing about which there are divisions, pre-existing divisions, but it's not clear to me for whom is this divisive. We've articulated who we want to include. Whom are we claiming that this is divisive for? We should be super specific and not beat around the bush on that. And my second question is this, and I say this again respectfully. As much as it has been forwarded that the notions of the presence of systemic racism is a matter of debate or subjective, I submit that it is not. And I submit that it is not with the evidence of Article 1, Section 2 of our United States Constitution. It's there. And that legacy continues on through, right, post-Reconstruction, 100 years of segregation or quote unquote whites only society. 3 decades of discrimination and redlining and GI bills, right? Another 2 decades of urban renewal, even on up to the housing crisis, which targeted Black and Brown borrowers with subprime loans, even when they qualify for prime loans. And just last week, I saw an article that in Charlotte, the average Black homeowner, there's a $40,000 gap between the value of their home and the value of other folks' home in the area. This is not a debate as much as whether the earth is flat is a debate or whether the solar system is heliocentric. We're not talking about the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot here, right? The two arguments do not hold equal weight. And so leaving it open to just say racism, right, as people understand it or don't understand it, unfortunately, even with these glossary terms, which I do think are great, they're great definitions, it's a very fine people on both sides approach to discussing racism. And I think that leaves us talking about racism as a matter of exclusively personal agency and not social structure. And I kind of end by saying this, right? The function of educators is to teach, and I feel like these standards do a good job. It's not as if they don't address American exceptionalism. It talks about critiquing that. Our job here is not to rescue America from constructive critique or to project optimism. What we need is not the power of positive thinking. That's not what's going, right? That's not going to change anything for us. Our job, as some of my preacher friends like to say, is to tell folks what God loves, and that's the truth, right? And however that leaves folks feeling is up to them. I'm American, right? My family has been here. The patriarch of my maternal side of the family was an emancipated enslaved person in the Darlington area of South Carolina. I've been here longer than a whole bunch of folks. Okay. So I reserve the right to say and think what I want to as an American. It's not my job to try to stack up and say, is this positive, and try to shape the contours of whether it's balanced with crit. That's not our job. And lastly, we know, y'all, that while we were debating these very standards on January the 6th, an insurrection was happening. A violent attempted coup, right? About a contested election that, again, dealt with a lot of votes from Black folk, okay? And so the way that we move through that, get over that, and I'm not certain, right? But the way that we don't do that, let me say, is by pretending like these aren't real, dogged, durable, systemic issues that have to be addressed in the way that we're educating folk. Because in part, by not doing so, we facilitate that sort of reaction, and the reaction of it being unprecedented when it in fact is not. It is part of a historical pattern that we should be engaging young people in the process of thinking about, which is precisely what those young people that Ms. Cammett said referred to, said that they wanted to hear, above and beyond even what the teachers, they said they're not getting it. And so that should be our North Star going forward. And so those two questions, I apologize that they got lost in the sauce, but why are we doing this? For whom are we responding to this for? And is there any really real debate about the presence of systemic racism are things I would like to hear addressed?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
This is Lieutenant Governor Robinson. I'd like to respond to that.
If I could hear from with respect to DPI, the logic behind those two questions, I'd be happy to hear from our Lieutenant Governor, but I did want to know from a DPI perspective the response to those two questions.
Now, let me get this. The very first question is, why are we doing this? Why am I doing this?
I think the question is addressed to DPI, Lieutenant Governor.
Okay. All right. Well, let me deal with one thing first. And I want to deal with this up front. I was going to say something about it during the last meeting, but I did not. I checked the minutes and I looked through the records. I did not see anyone make any statements at the last meeting in any of the meetings, when we saw Raleigh on fire, when I saw my hometown of Greensboro on fire, when I saw Fayetteville, other cities around this state on fire, when we were having riots, not protests. Let's get this straight. Protesters hold a sign, they chant a slogan, they get politically involved, they get politically active. Rioters break windows, turn over police cars, destroy businesses, loot businesses. We saw that all across this state, and not nary a word did I hear out of anyone's mouth, or see out of anyone's mouth, from this board or any other, about those riots that we had. In fact, I saw the exact opposite. I saw folks encouraging people to continue to put the, quote, pressure on folks to make changes by rioting in the street. That's number one. When we talk about the so-called insurrection at the Capitol last week, we need to realize where that came from. That came from setting a standard of allowing lawlessness to reign on our streets. And it didn't start in Washington, D.C. It started right here in Raleigh. It started in Minneapolis. It started in Greensboro, when we allowed rioters to tear up our cities. That's number one. Number two, I'm going to reiterate my thoughts on these standards one more time. As someone who holds education near and dear to my heart, and as somebody who is a solid conservative, a solid Republican, if I enter a classroom with conservatism, republicanism, what I believe about those subjects, if I enter the classroom with the intention of putting that agenda over the agenda of educating those students, I have failed. And I believe we have failed with these standards, because I don't care what anyone says. You want to speak plain? These standards have put an agenda above the education of our students. It doesn't. I don't care what anyone says about it. I'm not backing off of it, because I see it and I understand it. Someone asked me a question about second grade standards. I'm reading right here in second grade standards where it says, explain how various indigenous, religious, gender, and racial groups advocate for freedom and equality. We're asking that of students that right now, and I'm sorry to say this, in many places we are failing to even teach our second graders to read on a first grade level. These standards do not do anything to move forward progress in our nation. You talk about the history of this nation. Yes, there are positive things we need to talk about, and there are negative things we need to talk about. Positive things we need to talk about is the fact that our Constitution held back the power from slave owners. And our Constitution, yes, at one point allowed Jim Crow to be the standard in this nation. But our Constitution also made it possible for Jim Crow to be squashed. The system of government that we have in this nation is not systemically racist. In fact, it is not racist at all. And these standards smack at something that teach children in our schools, that this nation that has seen itself go from a nation that once upon a time allowed slavery to now having had a black president for 2 terms, and for the first time in this state, a black lieutenant governor, second in command in this state, that this is a racist nation. Folks, that is not true. And when we write standards that point in that direction in any way, we are doing our students a disservice, whether they be black, white, brown, Native American, straight, gay, it doesn't matter. We need to be teaching our children standards that are going to allow them to be encouraged to be North Carolinians and be Americans. And we can do that by teaching them warts and all. But we should not be doing it by anybody's agenda. And that is exactly what's going on here. There are folks that have an agenda with this stuff. I see it plain as day, and I am not going to sit down and take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Ford, returning to your questions, Superintendent Truitt, Dr. Stegall, either one of you all want to have a crack at those questions?
This is Catherine. What was the second question, please? Mr. Ford?
The second question is there any real substantial debate about the presence of structural racism?
So the first question, Mr. Ford, are you asking why we are doing this, as in why are we in the situation that we're having a called meeting today and discussing draft 5, or why? Is that what the question is, or is it a larger question?
Yeah, I guess specifically, what was the origin of us wanting to switch the language, take the word systemic out of both discrimination and racism and gender? What was the origin, or what was the calculus and what was the genesis of us wanting to take those terms out?
Sure. So I'd be happy to address that, and Dr. Stegall, please jump in if I say anything that is inaccurate. So there were standards after I believe about a year of work, and all of the efforts that were outlined in our presentation by Lori Carlin. Those standards were presented last summer at the State Board of Education meeting, and I believe one or two state board members said that there needed to be more explicit language added to the standards, and so that work was done, and the draft 4 standards were presented in January, and there were 3 board members who requested that the department consider expanding the definitions of racism, discrimination, and identity to include multiple types of those things. At the same time, I asked, prior to that meeting, I wanted an opportunity to weigh in on the process as for obvious reasons, and requested that to the SLA committee chairs that we change the inquiry standards to reflect a standard that would indicate that all standards should consider multiple perspectives, analyze cause and effect relationships, compare and contrast historical narratives, competing historical narratives, and evaluate major debates among historians. I was told that this was not possible because of our obligation to follow the law, and there would not be time for a public comment period if we were to make those changes. And so consequently, the only changes that were asked to be made were changes to those 3 terms. So that's where we are today. And I believe that those 3 terms do not exclude a conversation about the extent to which institutions in our country are characterized by systemic racism. That conversation is still able to occur, and the same holds true for discrimination and identity. As I said earlier, there are gender identity. If the standard reads, if it specifies gender identity, that doesn't allow for other kinds of identities such as economic, regional, those types of identities to be included in the conversation. And the same is true for various types of discrimination and various types of racism. As far as the second question goes, you, again, I want to make sure I am understanding. You're wanting to know if the standards allow for there to be real conversation about the extent to which systemic racism exists in our country. Is that correct?
Specifically, I'm asking kind of you to substantiate the notion that systemic racism is indeed subjective.
So my answer to that is that, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding what systemic racism means, but I think that the systemic racism does not imply that certain laws or policies are racist. Systemic racism indicates that our entire system of government and our Constitution are, as it is written and has been amended, are racist.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I've stopped.
I was just going to say, I think this is actually a really fruitful discussion that we often don't make time to have. And that is, there's not, I don't think there's a whole lot of understanding across the board of what we even mean when we say that. And this is where I think that the definitions that have been provided in the glossary are helpful. Whether or not it's an indictment on the entirety of the government is, I don't think, what's being discussed here, but I do think, as I provided evidence for just in 30 seconds, there's a hundreds of years plus legacy of actual laws, policies that are the systems that hold the present reality in place. And that racism lives not just from person to person, but lives within those systems, in those laws, in those customs, norms, practices, etc. And so I'm just wanting to know if that is truly up for debate here.
Mr. Ford, and Superintendent Truitt, I would say that you just gave us an example of the kind of discussions that we need to be having, that we hope that this revision will encourage in our classrooms.
Yes, Ms. Kamnitz, if I may, I think that the answer to that question, Mr. Ford, it lies in the role of the supporting documents. Because the glossary is in placing it next to the in placing it next to the standard on the unpacking documents. There is those definitions include the types of racism, discrimination, and identity that we are talking about.
Madam Chair, it's my final comment or question, and I apologize for taking up so much time.
Okay.
But is it possible for us to do all of the above, to keep the language from draft 4, and yes, include definitions in both the unpacking and the glossary? Again, to me, that doesn't seem like that it has to be an either or, but rather a hybrid of both of those things, which would accomplish the objective of defining those things while also spelling them out explicitly, which to me is more of a refinement than using a general term.
Ms. Kamnitz?
Yes.
May I?
Yes, and then we'll move on because we've got a couple people who want to speak.
Oh, yes. So I believe the answer to that question is that there are standards, there are objectives within the document that where it would not be appropriate to discuss gender identity when really the identity in question is the economic identity of a group or the religious identity of a group. And so and the same would hold true for racism. There are objectives in the document that where the term systemic racism is not applicable. And so to use those terms with such specificity would not be accurate in many cases, which is why it's important for the glossary definitions to be specific, but the terms within the standards themselves to be more encompassing and expansive.
Thank you to both of you for that discussion. And I'm going to move on and recognize Ms. Morris.
Thank you, Ms. Kammitz, and thank you everybody for this discussion. As I always say, my leadership style is I like to lean into the discomfort, and I think, as Ms. Kammitz said, the conversation we just had between Ms. Truitt and Mr. Ford really helps us lean into some of these deeper issues that we're getting at. So thank you. I think to Mr. Ford's point, this conversation is clearly a microcosm of a larger political debate that's happening across our nation. However, as representatives on the Board of Education, I challenge you guys to step outside of any political role that you might fill and lean in to doing what is best for the children of North Carolina. Because that is our goal of this board, and that is the goal of these standards, and that is the goal to not be lost in any sort of political debate that takes us away from what is best for our students. As a teacher, and I have been in many diverse roles, teaching literally kindergarten through 12th grade, teaching some of our most at-risk students of our state, down to some of the most privileged students of our state. And I know that one thing that is the utmost importance to our students' education is their engagement in our curriculum. The ability for our students to say, I see myself in what I am learning, extends beyond any political conversation we can have. Our students have to have entry points into our lessons so that who they are, their identities, their families' identities, and their families' histories are seen and heard and validated in the curriculum. I think that if we are able to see our students from the many complex histories that they bring to the table, we will be helping our students engage in a deep level in our schooling so that they can stand up and they can confidently say, I matter, and I matter in my school, and my teacher sees me, and my teacher wants to validate who I am. It is one of the most patriotic things we can do to recognize our complex histories. It is not overly negative. It is not a detriment to our students. I would actually argue it's the exact opposite. To say, I have one history, but that's different from all of the different subsets of society that come together into my classroom. And we're going to recognize them all, and we're going to validate them all, and that's going to help my students connect to their curriculum so that they can graduate and move on into our society. I think that it is of utmost importance that we lean into the hard conversations, that we recognize that the hard truths are a fact of our nation, and we are not fooling our students when we do not include those in our standards. Instead, we are giving them an entry point into the curriculum and saying, we see you and you matter. And that has huge ramifications for whether or not they are going to buy into our schools and graduate one day from high school. And if you don't believe me, I challenge you to go sit with some of our most at-risk students and have a conversation with them and ask them, do they see themselves in what their teacher teaches? And would that have an impact on them if they do not see it? If you don't want to lean into this conversation from a political lens, please go talk to our children and talk to the children who are not succeeding in our schools. This has ramifications. And I would want to close this by saying that I believe saying yes to including multiple diverse perspectives on our history, including the history that might be termed as negative or the hard truths is in fact a beautiful representation of what it means to be patriotic, because it is saying we recognize what happened, we are going to take and learn from what happened, and we are going to move on to the future and celebrate the voices of all.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Vice Chair Duncan, I believe you want to speak.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kim. I want to start by thanking you and the department for the extraordinarily hard work that's gone into this very difficult and complex process. And if anyone had any doubt about the challenge level, I think the intensity and passion that's been brought to this debate helps clear that up. It's an extremely difficult task, and that people care about it. I want to note that, as I think a few others have, that this has become increasingly significant and a debate filled with passion, because we've had a substantial increase of interest in these issues in more recent times, which include the need for transparency, the need for accuracy, and the need for a well-rounded view of history. That's a good thing. We should stop for a moment and say that's a good thing. I want us to then think about the teachers. Teachers are in the middle of this debate. And this debate, in terms of what a teacher may teach, can be viewed from any different series of ways that people may hold. And yet it's important that our teachers convey history in a meaningful way. So trying to take some compendium of the discussion we've had, what is the purpose of history? And I've heard a lot about it's important that there have been wrongs that have occurred in our history, and that those wrongs need to be covered in a transparent way as part of what we do. It's also been discussed very strongly that there are exceptionalism pieces of our history that need to be lifted up because they provide inspiration, they provide hope. More importantly, they provide instruction for our young people. It's the type of character and the type of lives that need to be led in order for democracy to truly succeed. The question then comes down to, do these standards give our teachers the room to teach history so that we can, in fact, do the two basic things that history should do? One of them is, when there are wrongs committed, we need to educate all of our people about those wrongs. And we do that because one of the most significant parts of teaching history is that we seek to avoid repeating it. We seek to learn from it. We want to learn from it and be a better democracy than the one we are. That's an evolving process. It has evolved since we were first established as a country. And there are so many great things about the country to celebrate, but there are also many, many, many wrongs that have been committed that we also need to acknowledge and learn from. And of course, the other aspect is the great things that have been done and occurred, and there's so many of them. How do we lift them up in a way that serves the purpose of character building for our students, provides inspiration, provides hope, and provides a sense of civic involvement that our young people will want to be a part of this as they go forward, as opposed to disengaging, which we have feared has occurred with respect to our social studies. So the ultimate question is, do these standards provide the ability for a teacher to bring forward with high-level teaching the lifting up of the many accomplishments that are so important for our young people to know about, while at the same time acknowledging and analyzing the wrongs that have occurred, which our democracy cannot be stronger unless we acknowledge and address those, and we can't do that without all of our people, including all of our young people, ultimately having a good factual basis for discussions as we move forward. I believe that the work, often people use the term thankless task. This time, for the standards, I don't want to use thankless because I think all of us are giving us thanks, but it's a very difficult task. I think what our staff has brought forward, and I believe what the committee is seeking to do, is to find a place to give our teachers the ability to serve the purposes of what history instruction should be with the standards that are being set out. And I appreciate the debates on all sides of the issue. They've been very important and very beneficial. But I want us to step back and think, can it not be accomplished within the standards as they've been set out with our skilled teachers setting forth history as needed by our students? Thank you for giving me an opportunity to make a comment.
Ms. Kamnitz, this is Mrs. White.
I'm apologizing. I didn't realize I was muted. Go ahead, Ms. White.
Okay, thank you. So many things that I feel and know have already been well articulated by the diverse set of conversation that we've already had. I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves is about the use of the word framework. And do these standards fall under the framework and the basic understanding that the United States of America and North Carolina is a great nation and a great state? Do you believe that? And do you think that the teachers who teach in our classrooms should be promoting America as the greatest nation on this earth? And I believe that we should. Had the opportunity to take a mission trip to Cuba 2 years ago, which is not a democracy. In that nation, I saw extreme abject poverty. I saw multitudes of houses without running water. I saw failed road systems. I saw peoples and oppression everywhere I went. I think the idea of privilege in this nation is so misunderstood because we are the nation that has the greatest privilege above any other nation. I respect the process. I respect the ability of many different voices to be heard during this process. I'm not afraid of the hard conversations. I do believe we should tell the truth. I think it is important for all of us to understand that while the voice of a teacher in a classroom is powerful, the power of the social media and the press is even more powerful. And anything that we say during the 1 hour period that any of our students are focused on social studies standards will soon be drowned out by any agenda that is promoted through things which we cannot control. And right now, it is important for all of us to realize that there is a very anti-American, anti-capitalism sentiment being generated by folks who are in control of many media platforms. It is our job to share with our students the successes and the failures of this country, the rise and the fall of this nation. In fact, I would dare say that the success of this nation has come out of our deepest adversity. I'm proud of where we are today, and I want to continue to see us work together to make this nation a great place to live, to work, to play, to raise families. I will echo the sentiments that I shared at the last meeting. While I think that some of the revisions have been very helpful, I still see an agenda that is anti-American, anti-capitalism, anti-democracy. Someone in the conversation today asked for a specific. And so I'm going to turn you towards page 5 of 7 on AHE.1 under the economics objectives. Analyze the American economic system in terms of affluence, poverty, and mobility. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it says deconstruct multiple perspectives of American capitalism in terms of affluence, poverty, and mobility. Yes, we should be doing that. Explain how relationships between entrepreneurship, management, labor, and consumers have impacted the quality of life in American society. We should be doing that. Explain the causes of economic expansion and retraction and the impact of the American people. Compare how some groups in American society have benefited from economic policies while other groups have been systematically denied to the same benefits. But the negative slant of this is that there's no step in this particular subset of standards that says explain how the American people and the American government have put systems and programs in place to contribute to the economic prosperity of the American society in terms of equality, equity, and mobility. Today, we have SNAP, we have the Affordable Care Act, we have Medicaid, we have the Child Health Insurance Program, we have subsidized housing, we have financial assistance through SSI, we have welfare, we have Head Start, we have Pell Grants, we have unemployment. All of those things have been put in place to ensure that there is an opportunity for excellence, an opportunity for all citizens. Can we do better? Yes, we can. Call it the Pollyanna approach if you want to. I'll identify as a Pollyanna today. But I think that our nation is better together than it is divided. And I believe that if we allow these standards to allow the creeping in of negativity, the creeping in of the dismantling of democracy, the creeping in of an idea that this nation is not great, in 20 years we'll be scratching our heads saying we did this. So you're right, it is important that we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. White, and thank you to all of my colleagues around this virtual table for this lengthy but really helpful discussion. I said earlier that the folks at DPI who've been working on these standards had a wealth of experience, and I think that the same applies to all of us board and advisors around this table. We bring our own personal experiences to the table, and every voice is important, and I think that's just what we've heard. So thank you all for the discussion, and thank you, Chair Davis, for giving us so much time on this topic, on this very important topic. And I will turn it back over to you, Chair Davis.
Well, thank you, Ms. Kamnitz, and add my own appreciation to our staff and teachers, our superintendent, and to my colleagues for proving that once again, in times of great division over topics that invoke deep personal beliefs and feelings, that civil discourse is possible. And we will have further opportunities to demonstrate that skill in the days ahead, and remain committed to finding the best course for our students' future education. We'll now turn to the Business Operations Committee report. I recognize Vice Chair Duncan, the chair of the Business Operations Committee. Vice Chair Duncan.
Thanks, Chair Davis. Along with Todd Chastain, we work as a team on the Business Operations Committee, and we have one action on first reading item today, BizOp 1. I'm going to try to briefly summarize it. It's something that has come before the board before, and then if there's questions, I know we have staff members ready to respond to those. This is a contract with Bank of America Public Capital Corp. for LEA financing of replacement school buses. This is contract being established to facilitate what the legislature has authorized, which is LEA financing of school buses over 4 fiscal years. Typically, about $60 million to $80 million in purchases are facilitated annually. School buses are replaced from state funds appropriated specifically for the purpose and in accordance with the applicable statutes. The fund source is state funds. It is not part of the DCI operating budget. Financing of school buses has occurred each year as long as the funding was provided by the General Assembly for new replacement buses. With respect to this proposed contract, generally multiple bids are received. However, this year there was only one. The sole bidder met the technical specifications. Although it was the only bidder, this vendor bid a lower rate than their 2020 rate. It held the contract for several years, but even though there was not multiple bidders, there is in fact a lower bid price. And so with that background, BizOp committee would propose or ask the board to approve this contract so we can continue to provide this service to the LEAs through the enabling legislation of the legislature. Any questions or comments, we have staff available to respond to those on this item. All right, I'm not hearing any after what I hope was an appropriate pause. So with that in mind, let's go on then to BizOp item number 2, which is the 2021 legislative and state budget priorities. So at this time, we have done a lot of work. You will recall in January, the board had continued to elevate what its priorities were. And in doing that work, the superintendent and her staff just coming into office needed, obviously, some time to review carefully and to also input important parts of any vision that is coming forward from the state superintendent, which I believe she's going to address with us in greater detail at our meeting next week. And we look forward to that. But some of what we've done at this point is taking into account the state board's priorities, taking into account additional items that are going to be important to accomplishing the board's priorities, and also I think will ultimately be part of the superintendent's vision. And so the 2-page document you have before you sets out transition and recovery strategies in 6 areas for our budget. The first one is to address statewide learning challenges and recovery, and that's consistent with what we've done before. The second one is student mental health, well-being, and school safety, and that's been important to the board as well as the recovery. And I think our board has pretty well spoken in one voice, and I think the superintendent's consistent with this to say that student mental health, well-being, and school safety is an equal partner with addressing statewide learning challenges for the recovery for our schools and to come back from the disruption that we suffered from the pandemic. Our third area is education workforce development. Our fourth area is school business modernization, which I think the board is familiar with the issues that we've been dealing with in that area. The fifth area is connecting middle and high school students to post-secondary and career opportunities. This has particularly become an emphasis over the last 2 or 3 years. It is an important ongoing emphasis for our state. And then other department requests. So you'll see the items that are listed as in these different areas right now, with the exception of the other department requests, because those are still being worked through as a list. A great deal of progress has been made. There's still work on costing, and there's still work on the following balance that we all need to think about. As each of you know, on, I believe it was December 28th, President Trump signed the second ESSER Fund Act, or Relief Act, which included ESSER 2 funds. There will be a significant amount of funds that will come to the state board and the agency for decision about how to best utilize those funds, at least 10% of the $1.62 billion that have been assigned, and then there will be obviously funds that are sent to the districts as part of that division with careful and appropriate guidance with respect to how to best use those funds in light of the recovery work that is underway and will remain underway for our students through the next year at least. And so we're still working. The reason there's not final numbers here yet, and we'll work to have those to you by early next week, is we are trying to obviously take into account those funds, which are good until September 2023, while at the same time put together budgeting funds which we'll need for recurring means long term in several of the asks that we have. And we also want to be able to make sure that we are opening positions that we know we're going to need long term as part of our budget request, but doing so within the context of having the ESSER 2 funds coming in. So with that backdrop, we will come forward with a proposal for the state budget that takes into account those factors. In the meantime, we'll also be working, not for presentation next week, but for presentation in the near future, some important considerations for the board to undertake and think through, as staff will be doing also, and making some recommendations and thoughts known to the board as to how we can best utilize the ESSER funding to make the true difference that we desperately need for our kids. So let me stop here and have before you the 2-page document, and the things that are highlighted on there are things that we are bringing into play since the last time you've seen it in January for consideration, and want to get your thoughts and reactions to it if you have any now, with the promise that we'll have a more complete document including full information about proposed amounts associated with each of the items to you as quickly as we can in advance of our consideration of these issues at our meeting next week. And I'm going to pause and give a minute so everyone can take a moment to look at it in case that spurs any questions or thoughts.
Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
I may have missed this somehow, but the items that are highlighted in yellow how are they different from the non-highlighted items?
There are one of two things. There are either items that have come forward for further consideration that meets the board's broad category goals, or as methodologies to meet those goals, or two, they're a further breakdown of the board's goals, that is more precise breakdown of the board's goals that have been used in a broader terminology, and now they're more direct.
Thank you.
So those would be the two categories. Thank you for that question. All right, not hearing any questions for now. Please keep these thoughts in mind, and there will be additional information, including obviously proposed numbers associated with these important areas that we need to address with our students for the budget, and we will have a further, more detailed discussion then next week. And thank you for your ongoing work as a board. I've gotten a lot of input from many of you throughout the course of this process, and people have worked very hard on putting together priorities in a way that's meaningful for our students. So I'm thankful to all of you for the work that you've done now over the course of several months, and we will come back with something hopefully we can reach a very good point on next week. Mr. Chair, I think that's our report today.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. So, colleagues, that concludes our committee work for the day. And seeing that we have no new business items, that brings us to our one action on first reading. I now ask for a motion to approve BizOp 1 as presented.
Olivia Oxendine, Chair Davis. I make the motion.
Motion by Dr. Oxendine. Is there a second?
Second is Mr. Ford.
Second by Mr. Ford. Any questions or discussion on the motion to approve BizOp 1? Hearing none, Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. White,
Yes.
Mr. Chastain,
Yes.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell, Lieutenant Governor,
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Motion carries. That concludes our work in open
Treasurer
session.
Falwell's yes vote. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Treasurer. I now ask for a motion to go into closed session and note for the audience and online listeners that following closed session, this January 27, 2021 called meeting will adjourn immediately. Vice Chair Duncan.
Thank you, Chair Davis. I move to enter closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute, Section 143-3-318.11A1 and 6, to discuss confidential personnel matters. Also move closed session for North Carolina General Statute, Section 143-318A13, to consult with the board's attorney in order to retain the attorney-client privilege. And finally, ask to enter closed session with respect to a discussion in closed session of ongoing litigation in the cases of Esslinger versus the North Carolina State Board of Education and Minnick versus the North Carolina State Board of Education, so that we can receive advice from our counsel.
Motion by Vice Chair Duncan. Is there a second?
Second, Dr. Donna Tipton Rogers.
Thank you. Second by Dr. Tipton Rogers. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. White,
Yes.
Mr. Chastain,
Yes.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell,
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor,
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Okay, the motion carries. Let's move into closed session as soon as we can. So I'd ask for those who are not part of closed session to please drop. And Dr. Townsend Smith, let us know when we're ready.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You bet.